Okay, great. So I'm going to get started since we're already 2 minutes over. Okay, so first, Blackin Microbiology would like to thank all of our sponsors for helping us make this event possible. We would like to say a special thank you to our gold level sponsors, the American Society for Microbiology, the American Society for Virology, and QIAGEN. Their generous support is instrumental to the success of Blackin Microbiology this week and beyond, and we appreciate their continued effort in supporting and recognizing Black microbiologists and their contributions to science. So now I'd like to say thank you everyone for attending the inaugural Blackin Micro Week. My name is Kishana Taylor, and I'm one of the 2 lead organizers for Blackin Micro. We are really excited about this week and what we have planned, and we can't wait for you all to see. So first up, we have our keynote speaker, who is Dr. Beronda Montgomery. She is a writer, researcher, and scholar who pursues a common theme of understanding how individuals perceive, respond to, and are impacted by the environments in which they exist. Dr. Montgomery received her bachelor's degree in biology from Washington University in St. Louis and her master's degree from the University of Central Arkansas. She then went on to complete her PhD in plant biology at the University of California, Davis, which is also where I did my first postdoc. And she later became a postdoctoral fellow in microbial biology at the University of Indiana with support from the National Science Foundation Award. In 2004, she joined the research faculty at Michigan State, and she is currently the MSU Foundation Professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology and of Microbiology and Molecular Genetics. As well as recently, she became the Interim Assistant Vice President for Research and Innovation. Yay! And so her primary laboratory-based research is focused on the response of photosynthetic organisms, so plants and cyanobacteria, to external light cues and nutrient availability. Additionally, Montgomery pursues this theme in the context of effective mentoring and leadership of individuals and the role of innovative leaders in supporting success. And so I will now yield the floor to Dr. Montgomery.
Thank you. I'm going to get my slides up and make sure there's no problem with that before I start talking. All right. We good to go? So I just wanted to first say thank you to the organizing committee for bringing together what looks like it's going to be an awesome week, a week that made me super proud to be a microbiologist. And I'm really thankful for the invitation. As I was saying to the committee, I say no a lot, and they sent Dr. Taylor, who I can't say no to, so I'm here to talk to you today. And I'm really excited that the theme for today is disparities in STEM education and my micro story. And I'm going to tell you a little about my micro story, probably not from the perspective you might be expecting. We're not even going to look at a cyanobacteria until much, much later. But I am going to tell you about the ways I've been thinking about my whole self as a scientist in recent days. And so it's this Blackin Micro Week, and I really enter all spaces unapologetically Black. I'm a Black woman who's a scientist. And, you know, as I think about the ways in which that has played out, I wanted to share some things with you, but I always like to let people know that I'm first and foremost a truth teller. And truth can at times be uncomfortable, but I'm a truth teller who doesn't believe that there's no hope for us. So I'm going to tell you some truths today. And the ones that are uncomfortable, they're all on me. Dr. Taylor did know I was a truth teller when I was invited, but I'm just going to move on into the story. So the thing about being a truth teller is that people welcome truth when it confirms what they know to be true about themselves or what they believe to be true about themselves. But truth becomes uncomfortable for us when it's a confirmation of things that we'd rather not know about ourselves or about which we're in denial, and when it challenges what we believe to be true. But walking through and to truth is important if we really want to get to the places that we claim we'd like to be. And so I'm going to talk about this in the context of disparities in STEM education, but I'm going to start with my version of my micro story. And my version of my micro story is that I really do love my life as a scientist. I've really enjoyed it, but there have been two extremes of being a Black woman in science, and that's both triumph and challenge. And I wanted to share a couple of recent events of triumph and challenge. So I'm the proud mother of the most amazing son, and I'm sure your sons or daughters are the most amazing to you. But this individual is the most beautiful individual on the planet. And he graduated from high school this summer in the midst of global pandemic. So I have this one child that I've been practicing how I was gonna cry, when I was gonna cry, all of it. And we had his graduation, you can see here, as a drive-in ceremony. And yet it was still a triumph. I was amazingly proud to graduate, an honors high school graduate who was moving on to engineering at Rochester Institute of Technology. And so we had a really great day celebrating his graduation. His graduation, however, occurred in the same time that this country was reckoning, and some of us re-reckoning with systemic racism against Black people in this country through the death of George Floyd. And so I sat in this moment of triumph and challenge where I was so amazingly proud of my son and also scared beyond reason to send him out in the world. That has reminded us time and time again that Black lives, Black male lives and Black female lives, men and women, don't have the same protections and privileges in this country as some others. I also had a recent triumph and challenge. As Dr. Taylor mentioned, I recently accepted a new administrative appointment at my institution at a challenging time to be supporting research given the fiscal crisis that we're all facing because of coronavirus. But I felt that this was a time that I could step in and try to contribute. So I was in the triumph, if you can call it that, of accepting a new leadership opportunity. And within the same 24 hours, we began to hear about the verdict or lack thereof of a verdict, the lack thereof of justice for Breonna Taylor. So while thinking about what it means to step into a leadership role on a campus that Black women are sorely underrepresented, and what that means for me personally, what it means as a role model, a mentor, and to contribute, I'm also facing the news in this country that the value of Black women is less than the drywall by which they sit. And so there's always been this tension that as a Black scientist, we live in a country that has persistent anti-Black racism, and yet we're expected to walk into our classrooms, our laboratories, and leadership venues and still contribute. And so I think about this as I think about what my micro story is and how we have these persistent disparities in our society. And so we live in a time where those who have declared that Black Lives Matters has expanded, including some of the leaders of our institutions. And yet we as Black scientists, we as Black microbiologists hear Black Lives Matter, and then we are confronted with the news that Black lives don't seem to matter as much as we might hope. And we go back into these spaces and hear again that Black lives matter, and we hear again and again and see evidence that there is still an issue in this country with Black lives mattering, even again as we're expected to enter our classrooms, our research spaces, and leadership venues and practice at the highest level. And so we continue to hear these names. We continue to say their names. We continue to mourn the fact that this country persist in anti-Black racism. And here I'm only showing you a few select names since 2015, which was the year that I was promoted to full. So we're looking at these names that persistently, day in and day out, week in and week out, as a Black woman in America, as a mother of a Black son, I'm seeing this persistent message. I'm hearing that Black lives matter, and I'm trying to make sense of that and what that means for my life as a Black person in the US, but also a Black scientist who functions in academia in this country. And so I told you that I'm a truth teller. And one truth I know is that if I ask, many of you, including white colleagues who are listening on the call, would say, yes, we're committed to Black Lives Matter. And these injustices that we see out in society, we need to address them. We've heard a lot of that of late. But we also have to be clear that there are persistent and longstanding disparities in STEM and in STEM education. And even as we'd like to think that what we see is happening out there, the reality is that many of the societal injustices that we witness happen both inside of and outside of the academy. And you may say, well, there's nothing as egregious as these deaths of Black people happening in the academy, but we do know that things happen, such as what happened with Christian Cooper, the Black birder who was, I say, accosted in New York, in Central Park by a white woman who decided to weaponize her whiteness and weaponize calling the police to get him to submit to what she wanted him to do. And so certainly Christian Cooper led to Black Birders Week, which led to additional weeks, Black Botanist Week, Black in Astro, including Black in Micro. And what we're hearing from Black scientists and Black students, staff, faculty in the academy is that some of the same ways that whiteness was weaponized against Christian Cooper has happened to us, and we fear will continue to happen to us unless we get really clear and are willing to walk to the truth and through the truth about how disparities happen in STEM education. So we're in this moment where there certainly are some global challenges that are felt by all. All of us are impacted by COVID-19, we have individual tragedies, life moments such as birth, sickness, death that happens to all of us. Yet we know that communities of color, including Black scientists and Black Americans, are disproportionately impacted due to health, economic, social disparities, and others disparities that lead to a collective tragedy that we have to deal with in addition to the persistent individual tragedies. We know there are many stories, including this one, that Black Americans have been hit hardest by the pandemic, and they're feeling the impacts of this virus, as well as inequities tied to the virus for race, but also the ongoing inequities that we see in terms of anti-Black racism and state-mandated police violence against Black Americans. And so we have to really be honest with ourselves that it's not just happening out there. And when we walk through the gates of our universities or the doors of our classrooms, our labs, or leadership spaces, that we're now in a meritocracy. Systemic inequities exist and persist even in the spaces that are supposed to be the great equalizer. So we talk about education as the great equalizer, but many of us will tell you that that's not our real and lived experience in these spaces, despite what you may see as success from many of us. So we have to really be brave enough to ask the question, what are these inequities that exist and persist? And then we have to be prepared to ask the question, what are we prepared to do about them, if we're prepared to do something about them? So disparities in STEM education, I just want to revisit that. I know it's hard to ask us to assess how we may have contributed to maintaining whiteness. It's much easier to point the finger outward than to ask ourselves the difficult questions about how versions of speaking commitment to equity, speaking commitment to DEI, yet consistently walking the path of inequitable engagement and assessment occur in your daily spaces, and to ask how you contribute to it. And the thing you have to be clear is that the marginalized amongst you notice. We notice when you speak commitment, yet walk a lack of commitment. And that really does have impacts on how these disparities in STEM and STEM education persist. So part of the conversation we have to have is getting real serious about the ways in which we like to talk about what we do in science and less frequently like to talk about how that gets done. So we spend much more time focused on what we do in academia and science in terms of outputs and placements. We talk about the number of students we've trained, postdocs we've recruited and trained, where we've placed them, the numbers of papers we've published, the metrics and impacts of the journals in which those were, the dollars we bring in, the awards that we win. We talk a lot about what we do. Less frequently do we talk about or actually hold ourselves accountable for the effective means or the hows of how this science is accomplished. And the reason this is important, we know specific colleagues, some of us could name them, that do very well in terms of metrics, but we know that you can achieve the metrics without mentoring in honorable ways, without leading in honorable ways. You can get the most stellar metrics and have done a lot of damage to people in the process. And so we have to get to the point of asking if we are holding ourselves responsible for how this is done. And if we don't, that is one of the ways in which these biases persist. So we really need a new focus. We need intentionality in asking and holding ourselves responsible for how we do our work, in addition to rewarding people for what work is accomplished. So one of the main ways that I think disparities persist in STEM is through gatekeeping. And gatekeeping is one of the most powerful ways that we sustain disparities and maintain status quo. And I've defined gatekeeping, as have others, but gatekeeping for me in mentoring leadership and engagement is defined as guarding who gains access and who advances based on conceptualizations and assumptions about who can function and who can thrive. So before you can enter, we try to decide if we think you'll be able to fit or succeed here, and you either gain access and opportunity or not, based upon these gatekeeping practices. Part of this is that we also say to ourselves, well, one of the ways we're going to measure this is through grit and resilience. And grit and resilience theory has emerged as a really powerful tool in recent years. There's indeed an increasing dependence on the importance of grit for individual persistence in academic settings. And particularly, we look for grit in those who come from marginalized and minoritized backgrounds. Often there are several different types of resilience that we think about. There's preventative resilience, which is the proactive establishment of personal capacity to deal with challenging events. So we often ask about this in fellowship and applications for graduate school. But then there's also restorative resilience, which operates when there's a need to recover from some disruptive or stressful situation. And I would argue that as institutions, we routinely rely on minoritized and marginalized individuals to disproportionately exhibit both of these forms of resilience. And indeed, these marginalized and minoritized individuals often persist in our environments, our inequitable environments, through undue grit. And yet institutions will readily claim this persistence as retention. And I have argued over and over again that individual persistence does not equal institutional retention. And so when we count the numbers of students who've graduated and we say that institutions are good at retaining, we actually haven't asked the question as to whether those individuals persisted because of undue grit. And what's the difference in my mind between retention and persistence? Retention is an active process that ideally includes reflection on the part of institutions. It involves cultural assessment and change where needed. Individual persistence can be that you persist despite every issue and challenge that's thrown at you, and yet that can be claimed as retention. So I want to go back to this idea of whether grit and resilience are the answer. Are they good or are they bad? I absolutely believe in the importance of grit and resilience. It's a trait that I value in myself. I certainly tried to impart it in my son. What I absolutely and unapologetically do not believe in is ignoring structural systems that routinely require more resilience of some than others. And I would argue that academia is a system that has routinely required more resilience of the marginalized and minoritized routinely to persist than they do of others. So in this form, in my mind, grit and resilience can be a powerful form of gatekeeping, because when we pay no attention to whether certain environments are inequitably requiring more resilience of some than others in order to obtain the same levels of success, then this search for grit and resilience, which, as I've said, have great intrinsic value, can as a result be misplaced as tools that amplify structural inequity and injustice, rather than as tools to promote success more broadly. And so I really believe, and it's increasing and growing belief to me, that we have misplaced grit in terms of selecting students and the ways in which it's positioned in our institutions. And I think that the commitment to concepts of individual resilience and grit, as well as institutions as resilient, particularly we ask this of our minority serving institutions, that this can be invoked as excuses not to really do the work and embrace more agile interventions that promote progress in terms of the institutional commitment to and innovations in promoting equity, as opposed to just finding people who have more and more grit and can persist in these static, and I would argue biased and status quo environments. I warned you I was a truth teller, so here we are. So institutional diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, I believe, can and have become about selecting the right marginalized people who have the undue tested grit that are able to succeed in our storied environments, which then we functionally place as infallible. We presume that the environments are infallible and have everything that's needed. And if someone comes in and struggles, then it's because they needed more grit. They needed more resilience. They needed more capital. And so we really do default to individual deficit models and prizing the storied and infallible environments of our institutions. And I have to tell you that this is exhausting. It's exhausting as a Black woman who's had levels of success by whatever measures. It's exhausting to exist in systems that would rather celebrate the unyielding grit, resilience, and stick-to-itness of the, quote, exceptional of the marginalized, than to ask of themselves as institutions why their expectations were so low and their systems unyielding to change and representation, not to even start thinking about how these systems may or may not be approaching equity. So then I told you I don't believe in just putting truth out there and leaving people in despair. What is the answer? if these are not the answers that we so routinely put out there as the answer. If I don't see those as the answers, what are alternatives? So again, we're going to go back to truth. And that's that our current diversity and inclusion frameworks, in my estimation, are failing us. And I think they're failing us because, as Sarah Ahmed said in On Being Included, diversity becomes about changing perceptions of whiteness rather than changing the whiteness of organizations. Changing perceptions of whiteness then can be how an institution reproduces whiteness as that which exists but is no longer perceived. And so if we want to do the work and not just talk about it, educators, mentors, leaders, everyone in the environment must rethink how they're doing things and stop focusing solely on deficits in individuals and ask about and prepare to fix deficits that exist and persist, and indeed in some cases were built into the systems in which we exist. And we have to ask the question, who was the system designed to include? And who was it designed to exclude? And really ask about how we're prepared to be really honest with ourselves about those questions and be prepared to make changes that are required if we really want equity and justice. Or we have to be honest and say we just want diversity. But we have to recognize that diversity does not equal equity. The ways in which we're measuring diversity about who's there, I heard some time ago that plantations were diverse if you looked at who was there, but there certainly was a lack of equity. So too many of our conversations in the academy really center on diversity framing from a deficit perspective. And we center what my colleague, Django Paris, has called an assimilate or fail model, where either we assimilate as success viewed through the white gaze or we fail. So this is an acculturation model. We often prioritize a faulty servitude of gratitude. And this is a framework that I introduced where we really, if people underrepresented, historically excluded, marginalized, minoritized individuals make it, there's an expectation that there is a gratitude that they've been allowed into a space and been allowed to succeed. And I have just rejected serving the institution through gratitude. I have a grateful spirit, but I serve the institution through my intellect, as opposed to being expected to constantly portray gratitude for being allowed to be in this space. And my colleague Caritha Mitchell has talked very strongly about how these institutions also enact know your place aggression. And this is where if you don't enter the space through this assimilate or fail, if you don't accurately demonstrate gratitude, success can be met with aggression, where you have to be reminded of your place as a Black microbiologist in these institutions that weren't built for us. So this expectation of gratitude is performed most violently as the demand for sacrifice, says Sarah Ahmed. And this sacrifice, I argue, is we are being this demand can really be too high a price for sacrificing when what we're most frequently asked to sacrifice is self-definition, is self-valuation, and self-affirmation. And so we're asked to enter these spaces seeking to be defined by external definitions, seeking valuation through performing, usually servitude or gratitude or assimilation, and seeking affirmation for doing the right things. And that's just too high a price to pay for entry into the spaces. And so I really think we have to enter these spaces through the political will, as Patricia Hill Collins would say, of self-definition and self-valuation, and also I add our self-affirmation. So if we want to do that, part of what we have to understand is that the models of mentoring that we've used, whereby we try to fix deficits in an individual, really can't work. We have to use mentoring and leadership that are combined with advocacy, where we recognize that true input into trying to transform a system realizes that you just can't guide someone through a pipeline that has blockages and inequities. You have to look at clearing the pipeline. We would never do this in our homes. If our pipes were flowing slowly, we wouldn't say, let's force more water through the pipes in hopes that more comes out the other side. We understand that that could be just a catastrophic failure in terms of destroying the structure. We recognize that when there is issue in terms of passage through a pipeline, that we have to seek the help of professionals to clear the pipeline and look at the structural deficits of the pipeline. And if we're going to get away from these longstanding and persistent disparities in STEM, we have to start really combining the work that we do with advocacy and clear the pipeline. So part of that means that we have to start by looking at culture versus climate. And there's been a lot of conversations about cultural change and what the cultures we want to establish in the academy. And we have to be clear what the distinction is. So culture is really a shared perception of a unit, a community, an institution. It's who we say we are. It's in our mission statements, our mentoring and leadership statements, our DEI statements. It's in the statements that Black Lives Matter. It's in our formal policies. But climate is a distinct thing. And we often stop at the conversation about culture and don't delve deeply into climate. And climate is really the lived experiences of, or the psychological impact of culture on those in units or communities. So we often are very happy to describe the culture we've hoped to build, but we are not as happy to ask those who are marginalized and minoritized what their lived experiences are. And we have to do that to really get a sense of whether culture and climate are aligned. Because in an environment that's seeking to move towards equity and justice, culture and climate, if your culture and climate if your culture speaks to equity, climate has to be aligned with that for you to be really moving in the direction that you want. Otherwise, you have pretty window dressing, but inequity persists and status quo persists. And these are the questions we have to ask ourselves. We often fail to adequately ask about or appropriately assess lived experiences, particularly of the historically excluded. And this is where things fall apart. This is where we have a commitment to equity on the surface, but all of those of us who are from minoritized and marginalized backgrounds would beg to differ whether there are true commitments in that regard. So then how do you actually think about building climate that aligns with the culture? How do you figure out if you have climate that aligns with culture and is likely to lead you towards change as opposed to persisting in inequities? And so there are 3 factors amongst others that are related to climate and environments of success. These are representation, reputation, and resources. And so representation is what we talk about, the structural dynamics or numerical composition and who's there. And even as I've said, you can have very diverse environments that are completely inequitable. Representation matters. One of the tweets I saw earlier was from Dr. Taylor and another Black woman virologist who met last year. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've given talks at national meetings that it's pretty clear that the representation was more impactful than my talk. Now, I think I give a great talk about cyanobacteria, but that just tells you how deeply important it is for some people to see a representation of themselves. In fact, many people to know that they can be there. And so many times people who are in the majority overlook that because you see representations of yourself so much that you don't understand the power of that when you are a one, a first, or an only. So representation is important. Reputation is also important. And this is largely based on the history of inclusion or exclusion or perceptions about this in a department or an institution as it relates to a specific issue, diversity, equity, mentoring. And certainly reputation too frequently we think is what we say, but it's what people share about their lived experiences. And reputation is really important because without a good reputation, you can have representation, but people are still treated poorly, as we talked about, the what versus the how. But ultimately, one of the most important is resources. And that's that when you have representation, you have a commitment and reputation, there still have to be actual resources, capital, human, financial, or otherwise, that are committed to particular issues and efforts that are related to change. We know in our institutions that when something matters, there's a budget line and there's usually an executive that has a title that incorporates that. And we really have to ask questions about how and where we're positioning such resources that are a demonstration of our long-term commitment to particular issues. So addressing climate is critical because even the most well thought out and designed initiative can be derailed by having a good statement of culture, but a non-supportive climate. And in many cases, these are collective responsibilities that are driven by mentors, leaders, peers, and all in community. So I did tell you that, you know, I try to not just leave in despair. So you may be asking, she promised me optimism. I'm not sure I hear optimism. And I want to start first with a message to my white colleagues that I have heard so many times in the past few months the question of whether I'm optimistic. And initially, I didn't get what that was about, but I realized that sometimes people need you to be optimistic. And I just want you to know that I aspire to optimism. Some days I'm closer than others, but even as I aspire to optimism, my optimism can't absolve you. So even if that comes to full fruition, my optimism is not the answer, nor is the optimism of your Black students or your Black peers or Black colleagues. And so you can't depend upon those who are most marginalized to carry the hope for the whole system. If we really want to have optimism, we have to continue to reflect. We have to learn, grow, and commit to doing the hard, long work ahead, recognizing that we'll make mistakes along the way, owning those, but absolution is in doing the work and fully submitting to the process of learning and growing, rather than depending upon those who are most impacted to carry the optimism for the community as a whole. So I'm gonna go, I know this is Blackin Micro Week, but you did hear I have a split personality as a plant biologist and a microbiologist. And one of the lessons that's been really impactful are lessons from plants, in which I've learned a lot from plants about how we need to think about our place in the world and our role in engaging with the environment. So this picture is a photo courtesy of my PhD advisor. I saw this picture during the first week of graduate school, during what I call the preparative professors, where you're trying to identify who you'll do a rotation with. I had no inclination to do a rotation with him. He's a lovely person, but I had already arranged my rotations with 3 other people. But he was so excited about this that I ended up working with him, doing my PhD with him, still work on this particular topic. What's so exciting about this is that these are 2 bean seedlings, genetically identical. So for all practical purposes, they're twins. They've been exposed to almost identical environments. So they've had the same amount of water, nutrients, humidity, temperature. Pretty much everything is almost identical. The difference between these is one critical factor. And that's that the seedling that is this white tall seedling has been in the dark. The other one has had all the same environmental factors, but has been exposed to light. And light is a critical factor that allows seedlings to transfer from being dependent or heterotrophic and dependent upon the nutrients that were lovingly gifted to it from the mother plant in the seed, to being able to green and make chloroplasts and green leaves, which are the equivalent of solar panels, and therefore to be independent. So we actually do something sometimes, well, not all of us, but sometimes we do this pretty well in environments where we have things almost equal, but we don't know what the critical factors are that are needed for individuals to either have success or fail success. And what's important about this is that, as I said to you, these 2 are genetically identical. So they have equal aptitude, but the result in different outcomes, one of them having a life of independence, one of them having a short life only supported by the nutrients it got from the mother plant, depend on what's happening outside of them, the environment. So whether the critical factor is available in the external environment depends on whether these organisms can either have success or not. This was mind-blowing for me because I listened to the ways in which we look at whether individuals are successful or not, and we very frequently go straight to what their deficits were without asking questions about the environment. Particularly, we do this when we're talking about our colleagues who are from marginalized or minoritized backgrounds. Because this is Blackin Micro Week, we do study a similar process in cyanobacteria. This is, I usually describe this as the 2nd most beautiful organism on the planet, behind Nicholas, who's taking care of my elder care and getting me very luxury accommodations. But this is actually the organism, the same organism. If we grow it in one light condition, it has one color. So this organism is chock full of green light absorbing proteins, which allows it to use light for photosynthesis. If we switch the organism to red light, over days, it will change its pigmentation to now have red light absorbing proteins reflecting green to the eye. And this is a reversible process where we can go back and forward. You can see below in the microscopy images that the cells are also different, where we have long brick-shaped cells in green light and more circular, smaller cells in red light. So similar to the plants, the external cues of light really result in an organism that's genetically identical, changing its form and function so that it can optimize its performance depending on what's around it. And so I really looked at this Lessons from Plants and really was struck by the ways in which stewardship matters. And so we know that the way the plants and cyanobacteria are able to take these light cues from the environment, perceive them, and modulate their networks, their genetic networks, their protein networks, and then match their outcomes so that they can maximize success in an environment. This is basically signal transduction. Well, what I noticed is that when we look instead at individuals, particularly again, our marginalized students, staff, or faculty or leader colleagues, we generally go straight to looking at the outcome. Did they succeed or not? If they did not succeed, we assume that they have individual deficits and we judge them incapable of fitting in the environment. We say that these are individuals with deficits. We have biases. Where we feel like we will help them, we often step in and try to have assimilation-based advising and mentoring to show them how they can fit in the environment. And if all of that fails, we deem them not a good fit. Instead, I think that we need to use stewardship-based transduction or mentoring and leadership practices that we know and we love in the ways we think about biological organisms that we study. We need to use these stewardship-based practices in our environments, where when we have individuals in a STEM environment, we're very aware about where there are positives, negatives, gaps in that environment. We help those individuals perceive whether the critical factors they need are present. And this certainly requires what I talk about as environmental stewards, mentors or leaders. And then we help them build networks and cultivate networks, developmental support networks that allow them to be well positioned to lead to outcomes that we would all hope for. And so I think that we have a lot to learn from the organisms that we study about the ways in which individuals and environments interplay, and to ask questions for how we are having stewardship over our environments rather than solely focusing on whether these individuals are able to fit in what we would presume is an infallible environment. So if I am enthralled with Lessons from Plants, I wrote a book about it. If you're interested in that, that'll be coming out in the spring from Harvard University Press. But because this is Blackin Micro Week, I wanted to come back to microbes and debut a lesson from microbes for today. So I've been really thinking about similar things that we learn from microbes, lessons that can really help us have stewardship-based engagement with our peers, leaders, those who we are leading or mentoring. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is our fascination with unculturable bacteria. And there's this paper from Stewart in 2012 that talks about how bacteria that can be grown in the lab are only a small fraction of the total diversity that exists in nature. And at all levels of bacterial phylogeny, there are uncultured clades that don't grow on standard media, yet we know they're playing critical roles for maintaining our environment because they persist. And so it's just interesting to me, over the years, I started doing microbiology as a postdoc, and I have been fascinated over the years with the curiosity and commitment that some people have to knowing that there are bacteria out there that they are incapable of cultivating in the lab. And our response is not that these bacteria are incapable of growth, but that we just haven't figured out the right conditions. And there are some people who will commit decades of their life to trying to figure out, the curiosity drives them to try to figure out what the critical factors are that are needed for these bacteria so that we can understand the magic and mystery of the bacteria and what they may have to contribute to our ongoing existence. And so Stewart goes on to say that an interesting approach to growing uncultured bacteria uses the bacteria themselves to determine the particular aspect of the environment that is important to their growth. So we often now will use sequencing to know that an organism is present. We now will sequence the genome to try to get clues from the genes that are present or the genes that are expressed or the proteins that are present, what that organism needs to grow. And this is really about us taking the time to tease apart the language of a particular organism so that it can really help us understand what its critical factors are that are important to growth, so that we can then understand the unique contributions that that organism can make to our ongoing existence, as well as just the beauty of understanding the organism itself. We as microbiologists can really be fascinated with this on end. And so it really brings me back to this thing that I've said many times over the years, that the richness of a microbe or an organism's life and the potential that's achieved or lost therein lies hidden unless we understand its language. And so really, what can we learn from this fascination that we have with uncultural bacteria is that we have much work to do to understand that our institutions generally represent a single type of medium that supports the success of a limited range of individuals. And if we genuinely want to support success broadly, we have to be positively curious about and commit to learning the languages and providing for the needs of all, including the marginalized and the minoritized, recognizing that each of us has critical roles to play and very critical contributions to make. And so we really have to get real with ourselves about whether our curiosity is there to understand why these institutions have only served some well, and just to be frank, have maintained whiteness. Because we really lose all when success is not supported broadly. We lose the contributions of all, we lose the contributions of them to our understanding and our community. So I want to end with a direct message to those of you who are here today who are Black in microbiology. And I just want to say that we need you. I know, and you need to know, that your contributions are valuable and needed, even when they're unacknowledged and unsupported in the spaces you occupy. It can be challenging, it can be exhausting, and if you're like me, it could just be downright infuriating to navigate the difficult times, difficult people and places, the biases, the microaggressions, and quite frankly, the macroaggressions that you will undoubtedly encounter, yet you have to persist in knowing that you are needed. And the greatest gift you can give to yourself is to honor your individual aspirations, to find and build circles of support, circles of affirmation, circles of accountability that see and support your vision for your life, your vision for your career, in order to cultivate, build, and maintain your career, and to thrive in and contribute to spaces that don't and even won't always acknowledge your value and your contributions. So I will end there and hope that we have a way to take questions. And thank you so much again for participating in this space and in this time today and in the rest of the activities that will come for Black in Microbiology Week. And I thank you again so much to the committee for the invitation.
Yes, I'm gonna clap for everybody. Yay, that was so good. Okay, so I think we had maybe one question so far.
Okay.
So the original question, and then it was edited, so I'll do both. So someone would like to know, would like to hear a little bit more about your ideas for changing academia.
Yes, so it's interesting. It's an interesting question because that question actually parallels the path of work that I've done outside of my microbiology and biochemistry. So I started doing work in the mentoring space, looking at mentoring undergraduates, because I know you have to get people early. So I started looking at mentoring high school students and undergraduates. And then I realized that they were being mentored by graduate students who weren't prepared always to mentor them. And so then I started focusing on graduate students and postdocs. And then I realized that graduate students and postdocs love to do that work, but they often thought they had to hide it from their PI. So then I said, okay, I need to do faculty development. And then I realized that if we really want to change the academy, we have to change leadership. Because no matter how much we have good players who are good mentors, if there aren't leadership structures of resources and accountability, you have good people doing good things, but the system's maintaining the status quo. And so I think one of the biggest changes we have to make are the ways in which we select and reward leaders. We now select and reward leaders who are about maintaining status quo and about getting higher rankings, as opposed to saying that we want to select and reward leaders who value and prize equity, even as we do excellent work.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the next question is, what advice would you give to a mentor that wants to desperately clear that pipeline?
So I do think that, you know, Changing systems is hard and slow, although I have learned in the middle of the coronavirus, if your system depends on tuition, you can change things fast that keep tuition coming in. But I do think it's important that mentors, we have to have some personal responsibility for preparing ourselves to be mentors, even as we wait for and hope that our institutions will also put structures in place that require that of more of us. And so there are lots of great resources out there for really doing some assessment of what your mentorship skills are, for identifying areas that you want to improve. And I think also one of the best things I did was to start to embed myself with groups of other people who were committed to culturally competent mentoring, to have systems of support for myself, even as the institution was still moving towards focusing on those issues.
Okay, great. Our next question is, do you have suggestions for those of us who were in academia but are now outside? Can we change the system from the outside?
Yeah, I think that we can. And so I think when you think about the ways, we often think about the ivory tower as kind of this, place that's in and of itself. And in some ways we are. But when you look at the ways that universities are embedded in communities, the ways in which the universities are connected to so many entities outside of the walls of the academy, we need people in all of those spaces who are holding the university accountable. And so, I think once businesses start to hold universities accountable for certain work, for contracts, things will change. When funding agencies start to hold universities accountable, things will change. And so I think that we're needed in all aspects of the environment that interface with the academy, and those you can put on pressure from many different ways, both inside and outside.
Okay, our next question is, what does learning and growing look like for those in academia? What can be done for an individual trainee, faculty member, department chair, et cetera?
Yeah, so this answer is going to seem like it is not related to what they said, but one of our biggest problems in academia is that we have a lack of trust in our relationships. And so we can't tell each other the truth. And we don't talk about trust because trust is not what we as academicians talk about. We talk about experiments, we talk about whatever, but trust underlies everything we do. Every time we use a centrifuge, we trust that it's going to work okay, but then we don't talk about trust in our relationships. And so one of the reasons that we can't make the change we need to make is because we don't have relationships with each other that we can tell each other the truth, particularly across the power dynamics, right? So graduate students and undergraduates and postdocs rarely feel they can tell the PI the truth without there being some issues with that. Even as faculty, if you're underrepresented, before tenure, you're worried about telling the truth. And so we really have to build into our work places and spaces that we can tell each other the truth, that we can try out these truths without offending each other and throwing each other away. But until we can face the truth, we can't fix it, we can't fix the problems. And so we really do have to get outside of ourselves and recognize that we are humans, and we have to have conversations about relationship building and trust and real honest conversations about race and sexism and all other isms that persist in these spaces, even though we like to think that we leave them at the gates of the university.
The next question is, do you think we have to develop a critical mass at each institution to make these goals become realized?
We can't wait on that. And so I think that that's one of the spaces that I hope this moment where we had shut down STEM and other strikes within these spaces has brought us to, is that everybody has a responsibility to make these spaces better. We certainly need to continue to actively and aggressively pursue critical mass. But in the meantime, we have to depend upon allies. We have to depend upon those who are in the majority really taking the responsibility to be culturally competent mentors, to be culturally competent colleagues. And we just can't afford to wait.
Okay, I'm going to combine two questions because they're fairly similar.
Okay.
So it's, how should Black trainees find support in an environment that may be mostly white? But then also, how do you combat the pressure from institutions to assimilate?
Oh, yes. Yes. So I think one of the beauties of this current moment is that we have spaces like this one where we have now, right? And I think maybe in 2018 or 2017, I wrote a paper about the use of social media to connect with people who are from similar backgrounds, because I still believe it matters to be able to have conversations with people who understand certain aspects of your life. And so where people are comfortable with virtual and social media based engagements, I think we're in this moment where there's been this explosion of communities. I remember the first one, Blackin STEM, started by Stephanie Page, is how I actually got involved in Twitter after I met her. Vanguard STEM, there are all of these communities that have been there for years, and now there are new communities even around these different areas that we research. And so I think that we're in a moment where you can really connect with peers, you can connect with seniors in those spaces. I think also before this pre-COVID moment, I took vast advantage of annual meetings to connect with colleagues who were from underrepresented backgrounds. And so usually every year at the meetings that I go to, I'll have a dinner or coffee with either my peers or either younger scholars or senior scholars to connect. And so I hope we will come out of this pandemic and get back to that, because I do believe face-to-face matters. But I think the most important thing is understanding that we really often think we need one or a few people who are guiding us. And I was the only Black student in my graduate program. I'm still the only Black woman in the tenure system in my college. And so being an only has been a persistent part of my life. And what I've recognized is that I can't depend upon one or two or three people to serve as mentors, but I'm really clear about the things that I need. And I've had some excellent white male colleagues who have served as very good scientific mentors. And then I've marched over to other departments, sociology, religion, or wherever, and found Black women faculty who I needed to have those conversations with. So I think once you give yourself the freedom that you're assembling a network of people who contribute, then you find some of them virtually, you draw up on those who are local, because you certainly need advocates and local mentors to help you navigate the kind of local heuristic knowledge that will be needed to be successful.
Great. Okay. Many of us are still the first something in our departments and institutions. What are your thoughts about breaking others through the faculty position?
Yeah, so I have this non-standard commitment to people that, I certainly think it's important to have representation in the faculty, but more important than anything, I think it's important that people find the space and place that feeds their motivation and love. I am a professor because this is the thing I love to do more than I love doing anything else. And if someone finds that thing they love to do somewhere else, I'm not going to be the one to try to convince them to stay. But I do think that the reasons people haven't committed themselves to the academy versus to other spaces is that despite the flexibility and freedom of working in the academy, it's still a hard place to be a Black woman or a Black man. And part of that is because of the biases, but the other part of that is that even if you're in a relatively good space, and there are few of us, if you persist, then you get asked to do so many other things. And so there are these constant challenges of our universities saying they need these commitments and not having enough people there to fill them. So it can be a tough place to stay, but it's also a good life. And so, I am committed to people doing what feeds their soul. I certainly would love to retire with at least 2 Black women in the college and not to retire as the only one. So I hope, and then if there were like 3, I don't know what I would do with myself. I might just have a party. I'm sorry. I told you guys I was a truth teller. Well, what is it?
Okay. As a PhD student, how can we ask for change and verify change is occurring and not sacrifice the end goal of graduating?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question because, it was a struggle that I dealt with as I started to get really interested in topics around mentoring and other issues in the postdoc kind of stage, in that you have to remember that as a graduate student, you're there for the degree. That's what you're there for. Having said that, there's some work that feeds your soul in ways that makes your science even more enjoyable. And so some of the advice that I got really early was figuring out what those things are that feed your soul and doing enough of them that you feed your soul, but not so much of it that you're getting distracted from the degree. And I think frequently what happens is that we have these things that are really important to us, and then we do too much of it because we really feel valued in those spaces. And we have to remember what the goals are ahead of us. And if there's specific work that you have ahead of you that requires a PhD, you have to keep that in your mind, that completing that degree is the gateway to being able to do this work of greater impact. And so I think it's about balancing based on stage, not even stage, you know, there are different times in life. Even a few years ago when my son was in high school, I pulled back from some things because, you know, as I said, I want luxury nursing home and he's my one shot. So I got to, you know, make sure. And so I think it's about balance, but I think that you have to know what those things are that are essential, do some of them, but balance that with making sure that you keep those core commitments that you're in a program or in a position for at the forefront of your mind.
That's so great. Okay, this is the last question that I have in the Q&A thing. So it says, what do you think you can do in your current position to broadly and maybe specifically address your local research climate so that we can recognize what we can do where we are and aspire to go?
So that question is a general you. What can you do in your research climate? So I think, you know, I'm hesitating because I recognize that, you know, one of the things that I've had to learn over the years is that systems change slowly. And one of the most important things that I have found for me and others is to understand your system as well as possible. So in all cases, I have really felt like I'm a system analyst, where you're trying to figure out where in the system you can make movement now, even as you move towards changing the system and into what it really needs to be. And I think too frequently we get committed to doing a certain work and we go full scale into doing that work without really stopping and looking at the landscape to try to understand where there's movement, sometimes where we need to strategically collaborate to do that. And so I think that we really have to spend a lot of time building relationships, building trust, and also really trying to assess the system for where there is an opportunity for us to start to have the kind of impact we hope to have. And I think frequently the problem is that usually we have to start doing that in small ways and we're ready to go out and change the whole system. And one of my colleagues, Kayvon Stason, who's at Vanderbilt, said one time that you have to figure out how to bend the system. And usually we want to break it immediately. And sometimes you bend to the point that things break and we realize we need to formalize them. But you have to figure out how to make movements in the system to have people recognize the work that you've done and to see that it's impactful. And that also gets you invited into new spaces to have new understanding and identify new other opportunities to continue to bend the system and try to move it towards the place where it needs to be.
Awesome. Okay, so I think we can squeeze in one more because I just got two more questions. Someone wants you to expound on the question about what you can do as a PhD student, but as a postdoc. So is there a sign that we should do the things that feel good and put science research to the side since we have the choice as a postdoc?
So, you know, the thing, it really matters, particularly as a postdoc, it's about what your next step is, right? And so some postdocs are in a postdoc thinking about a faculty position. Some are postdocs thinking about starting their own organization. Some are thinking about going into industry. And so I think you have to be clear about what products are going to be expected from the postdoc, what evidence is going to be expected from the postdoc for what you have planned next. And as you're able to make decisions that allow you to balance research with being engaged in other activities that position you for what's next, that's the kind of choices you make. But I think also one of the things that I did as a postdoc, and I just had a conversation with someone in a mentoring conversation about this, I think too frequently we underlook opportunities to engage and establish organizations and systems as a postdoc. So when I got interested in mentoring, I actually first joined a committee at one of my disciplinary societies that was doing work in mentoring. And so this allowed me to get involved in doing mentoring work, but also to be learning leadership skills by engaging with the disciplinary society. I built relationships with mentors there who wrote letters for me. And so I think sometimes we have to think about what we want to do and ask, how can we do that now in ways that also leverage other things we'll need, relationships with people, longstanding relationships with disciplinary societies that leverage the resources that may be in those spaces, even as we're still then contributing, but not completely reinventing the wheel. And then there are people like Judita Eisler, who built a whole organization while she was a graduate student and a postdoc, right? And so I think part of it is really figuring out what's best for you what's positioning you for what's next. And then when you do it, to do it thoughtfully, intentionally, and with the right mentorship and support and advocacy so that you have people checking in. It's actually how I started writing about mentoring and leadership, is that I was just out there doing service work. And one of my mentors said, if you want to be positioned to do this work for the long term, you have to do it in ways that are recognized by the Academy. And so we know that the Academy recognizes writing, grant dollars, high profile talks. I love to write, so I started writing about it. And so I think you have to have mentors and advocates who are helping you strategize about how you can do the work you want to do in the now that positions you for greater impact and making space for others in the future as well.
So we're at 5 o'clock. Do you need to go, or like there's a couple more questions?
If there are other questions, I'm good.
Yeah. Okay. So what can we say to mentees who worry that we are making changes too slowly?
So what I say to mentees who say we're making change too slowly is that they're absolutely right. And I think that when we don't acknowledge that, we lose them. And part of the reason we're making change too slowly is that institutions weren't built for change. They were built to be institutions, which has a kind of weightiness. But I think that what we have to say to people who are recognizing that we're moving too slowly is that one of the things that you have to do, it goes back to this watching the system, studying the system. Just earlier today, it's funny, just earlier today, I wrote a blog post about this because for years I have heard that things change slowly in academia. And then I literally watched in the span of 1 to 3 weeks, institutions go from in-class learning to online learning. And I said, wait a minute, we said things couldn't happen this fastly. And what I realize is that you have to learn and study what's essential to the organization. If it's deemed essential, it will happen. And so part of the ways in which I have been able to do certain work that I've done is institutions love rankings. And so I study what they measure in rankings. And in one of the rankings, I saw a commitment to postdocs and mentoring. I said, hey, I have something that can help you with this. And so I think change happens slowly unless you're able to convince people that it's essential to their core existence. And part of this moment is that it's our responsibility to document the ways in which change has happened in this moment. These universities have drawn upon staff, not just tenured faculty, to get classes online. People who are leading now would have never been considered leaders before. And so we have to document what's happening in this moment so that after this moment, when they tell us these things can't happen, we can say, excuse me, they happened at one point. And so you really do have to be a studier of the system and challenge them with their own rules, challenge them with their own behaviors, challenge them with their own activities. And then you have to have allies who I speak up many times for things that a graduate student has told me they want to say. And I'm like, I don't think you should say that, but what they gonna do to me? Let me say it, I'll say it. And so I think it's building the right advocates and allies, studying the systems, documenting what's possible, and then pushing when needed.
Okay, last question. As a PhD student, how do you navigate social challenges of being the only in a program, particularly challenges with faculty and deans who try to fit Black students into a box and have expectations of servitude?
Yes, so that's a tough one. That's a really tough one. And I think, the things that I have often encouraged students to do is the best thing to do are to find places and spaces on campus. So on this campus, we have groups for graduate students of color. One of them is an NSF-funded AGAP program. I know other campuses have IMSD. I think you have to find spaces, even that if they're outside of your department, where there are other students of color, and in those spaces are faculty and staff who are committed to supporting them. And you really do have to try to find the allies who can speak up for you. Even to this point now, I still have some pretty strong white male allies that sometimes I have to say to them, I can give you the script, but I need you to walk into the space and say this. And I think that there are those faculty and groups on campus who sometimes can fill in the void when you are the only. Those people, groups and spaces have been really important for me. I remember when I was at UC Davis, in fact, I engaged as a graduate student mentor in a program for undergraduates who were marginalized and minoritized, just so I could get to know the program staff. And when I ran into problems, they were able to say to me, you need to go to this person or this office. So sometimes we have to do some work of building the relationships that help us get connected to the right advocates and allies when we are the only one in a space. And there is this persistent, even to this day, there's a pressure to serve through gratitude. I'm like, I've told you guys I'm not going to do this. I wrote it in a paper. Should I quote myself? I'm not going to do it. But you have to find the advocates who support you in engaging in the spaces through those perspectives without undermining your success, which is really critical at the graduate student and sometimes postdoctoral level.
Okay, so that wraps up our keynote. Thank you so much, Dr. Montgomery, for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you.
I caught the spirit a little bit during your talk, so it was great.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I look forward to participating in the rest of this week.
No
you
problem.
guys have done an amazing job. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. Thank you. That's a wrap. Have a great evening. Yeah, evening.
Bye-bye.